Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Ben Kohlmann. He is an investment partner at Qubit Capital. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stuart. Looking forward to this.
What are you most excited about today?
Honestly, after our pre-show conversation, just the depth of things we might or might not get into, I think it's going to be wide-ranging, and I always love rapping with people who have unique views in the world, so this should be great.
Yeah, and my unique view has been tested greatly, like how unique it can get by spending the last 6 months in Argentina, almost by happenstance, coming into a socio-political revolution that is there's a lot of optimistic, there's a lot of challenges too, but it feels alive down here, which is a very interesting thing.
Mhm.
And so yeah, like going in blind, basically, what does it feel like is happening in Argentina right now?
Well, from the US perspective, it does seem a bit like an awakening. When Milei was elected, maybe 6 months ago now, maybe more. At least the US media was pretty skeptical of his approach. I think there's been a lot more silence because it seems to be working. And from what I can tell, the Argentinian people are at least open to the things that he's proposed and some of the cuts that have been made and some of the approaches. Um, I'm excited to see how this plays out. There's a lot of governments around the world that have tried to do a more communitarian, collectivist approach, and we see the results of that. There have been very few that have tried a true free market approach. And like this is the experiment we always want to see in the real world. The people of Argentina chose this route, and we can compare and contrast what the outcomes are.
Yeah.
I'm a strong believer as well that in on a long enough time horizon, reality wins. And I'm very confident that the Argentinian experiment will turn out to be great just because that's the system that works.
It's so I've been doing a lot of interviews. I got my Spanish podcast up and doing interviews in Spanish. And one of my recent guests what is like in the Libertad Avanza area. So he's not directly involved with Libertad Avanza. Libertad Avanza is the new political party that's arisen with Milei. The only reason that exists is because of Milei's kind of new take on this. And I told him that it's an experiment, that what Milei is doing an experiment. He's like, no, 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 it's not an experiment. It's a classical liberal. Like this is the whole reason why the 1800s were so prosperous is because
Mhm.
the Enlightenment tradition created this liberal kind of experiment, and that the real experiment is the welfare state, which and this is the challenging part that I'm facing because I grew up under a very different framework than I just described. The framework that I grew up in was that the welfare state was the saving grace of prosperity and such. Uh, and the big question I have is like long time horizons. Like, what is the most impactful change? And so, I can't see from when FDR basically took us off the gold standard and then Nixon finally severed it. Like, what part of what we're experiencing right now is based on those decisions? What part is based on the 1800s? This kind of goes back to the cultural kind of thing that's happening in Argentina, which is that there's very long time horizons. As you said, reality kind of like, oh, it wins. I also believer in that. It just may take a lot longer.
Yeah.
Um, and so, anything that I said there that you want to dive into?
Well, I think that this actually ties into technology and venture capital and markets in general is, you know, the long run victory comes from allowing a lot of small experiments to occur. And you have to be willing for those experiments to fail. Like there are a number of beliefs in my life that I've had early in my life that have changed based on what the evidence that I've seen. And I've shifted my view on some pretty important things given hypotheses that were disproven. And so you have to have a culture and society that is open to risk and is open to imperfection, but then correcting him. I'll give you an example. Last week, one of the SpaceX rockets crashed upon landing. It was the 23rd launch of this rocket and it fell over. And there was a very prominent author who on Twitter basically started making fun of Elon for failing. And I didn't understand what he was getting at. Like literally, SpaceX has done something no one else has ever done. And there's this mindset of if you fail once, it's not worth doing. It's like, no, you actually want rockets to blow up. You want things to explode. You want failures to occur so you know where their failure points are to then improvement down the line.
Yeah.
And in my own life, my the only growth I've ever had is when I've failed miserably. And so how can you do that on a society-wide scale?
Mm, yes, exactly. And going back to your earlier point of in terms of what is going on Argentina, I mentioned the classical liberal thing, but that was the way all of the countries worked inside of the 1800s and early 1900s. So it's hard to identify and a government in our era that is similar to what Argentina is doing. A recent podcast guest says that the only other libertarian experiment was in Botswana, Africa. That's the only
Mm.
place where in our modern democratic
Hmm.
republic type of institutions where a whole country has been under the political power of a libertarian. So in that
Hmm.
sense, there is an experiment going on here in our modern era, and like the biggest challenge right now is that Argentina. We were talking before about how there's this seed of prosperity in this country that was like in the late 1800s. Argentina was on the same track as the United States. That it was a huge exporter in terms of agriculture, huge like and not like there's an education system here too. Like there's satellite companies down here. Biotech is a big kind of a grower inside of Buenos Aires. Most of it's sort of like a outsourcing of helping biotech companies in the United States, but it's sizable. And nuclear power. There's nuclear power in Argentina as well. Um, and that's all because of this like base, this cultural base that's kind of being reawoken. And the Argentines, uh, they have this thing which I kind of like feel for them because I have a similar thing of not living up to their potential. And so like having this like long history where they've been humiliated, but it's almost like a humiliation and humble. There's those two words is like it depends on the point of view. And so Argentina is like there's a lot of problems and this could fail, but it doesn't feel like it's failing. Particularly the main thing that's changed in the city of Buenos Aires is that there were strong rent control laws that have now, and it was a very challenging period to find apartments. Now that is no
Mm.
longer the case. It's all like he repealed the rent control, and it's now like an extremely efficient market.
Yep.
Um, but like to understand where Argentina is, you have to understand at one point they were giving welfare checks to people taking a vacation. So if you went on a
Mm.
vacation to the mountains, you could petition the government for 50% of that the cost of the vacation. That is kind of how crazy it got here. So there's like that one point is just like one single point. Um, if you want to respond to anything in that, feel free, or we can kind of head directly into technology because actually let's go there. What is Qubit Capital? What are you guys investing in? What's your thesis?
So we focus on frontier tech, early stage founders and companies. We have a number of verticals: national security, specifically focused in the U.S., industrial resilience, and energy abundance. Very early bets on these technologies and founders, but the undergirding foundation is a belief in the divine and that human flourishing is a goal that we should achieve. And we believe that technology is an enabler for that. And we certainly have a financially focused outcome, but we also believe that, humanity moves forward because of the creativity and agency that individuals can express. And if given the proper capital and the ability to move forward, they can really transform society.
That's very interesting. Human flourishing, divinity, technology is an enabler. So far, for the past 20 to 30 years, particularly in the Bay Area, a lot of technology has this sense of being completely secular. And the secular part, and I don't mean to be theistic here, like I am not myself theistic, but I'm not atheistic either.
Mhm.
Like the in that combination between secular, there is no purpose, it's all meaningless, we're just monkeys, like that type of thing, I think is responsible for a large amount of the problems that we're experiencing right now. And it's so interesting given the past 4 years, like
Yeah.
seeing that happen. What's your take there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, our firm in particular, we have a a common faith background. We don't hire based on faith. We are open to whoever's capable, but we do all have a common view of the world, and that's rooted in Christianity. And we're not, evangelical about that, but like understanding that worldview is critical to then us deploying and having stewardship for the resources we've been given. And many of our founders are not of our faith, but we believe that the things that they're building will enhance the experience of humanity in search of that higher purpose and meaning.
Mm.
And just on a personal note, something I've been wrestling with deeply is the eschatology of technology. And eschatology is kind of a belief of the end times. And my history, I came from an evangelical free church and the Left Behind series and the Rapture, and it's a
Yes.
very
Oh,
premillennialist view. I'm now Presbyterian, and they have a different view on what Revelation teaches. And, Trey
yeah.
Stevens has talked about this recently about technology. And so as I think about like what does the future of our species look like in the religious context, like technology again is an enabler for that. And everything that we build, every piece of technology that works is actually in service to the human being and the human soul. And so things that work and that quote unquote make money in the market are solving a problem for humans to do better in some capacity. And if you believe that there's a better world we can build to an ultimate divinity of Christ down the line, like we can be part of that story, even if we don't know what the future holds. And there could be catastrophe down the line too. But like this is an enabling way to kind of drive that belief forward.
Okay, beautiful. So this is going to go into something I've noticed. I've been studying the 1960s. I grew up with this idea that again, like progress, welfare state saved us. 1960s was this beautiful revolution where everything is kind of like paradise on earth and such.
Yeah.
And so I entered faith and spirituality through that. So I've done a lot of study on, I mean, I grew up as a Christian. I grew up with the stories of Christianity and everything like that, but
Mhm.
rejected it in uh, probably in like my adolescence, and found spirituality, religion through this sort of new age type of things that goes to the East to try to find the wisdom. And I still very much feel like I found a lot of wisdom from the East, but
Mhm.
there's also been a return. And so when looking at the 1960s, I saw this. I've been studying it. Part of the crazy wisdom is actually going back and trying to figure out what happened in the 1960s, how that led to the political, I'm sorry, how that led to the PC industry,
Mm.
but also how it kind of affected culture. One of the
Mhm.
things I've most recently come aware of is the Bay Area singularity type of eschatology, which is saying that basically we're headed for a singularity, that technology is going to be the utopia. But at the same time, somehow, and I don't think the people who are offering this think about this, but at the same time, somehow it's also going to be a dystopia. And
Mhm.
that like it's going to be world ending, and that we must merge with the technology in order to save. Like even Elon Musk kind of goes into that type of thing. And what's really interesting, what I only found out about in the last month or so, is that I've been looking into the history of the Christianity. Most people don't know that in the 1960s, a huge amount of the innovation in terms of spirituality happened within the Christian churches.
Mhm.
So a lot of the Christian churches were actually looking east. A lot of cults started in this time as well, and like a whole bunch of innovation. But what a recent friend of mine who is an evangelical, who actually comes from the Catholic Church and became an evangelical, he was mentioning how 1960s, the reason why Christianity kind of really interesting stuff, thought that end times were coming, and so
Mhm.
stopped paying attention to the material world. And
Yep.
then something happened in the 90s where Christians actually started to realize, okay, well, that was false. There was no end times. And now is like more optimistic than the Silicon Valley, who have taken on that same 1960s feeling. And it's like, okay, it's all going to end.
Yep.
Like, what's going on? What's your take on all that?
Man, there's so much there. I will say one of the reflections I've had is in general, there's a lot of deep wisdom of the ancients. You can go to, Christian scriptures, Talmudic scriptures, the Far East. I happen to hold to the Christian view of the world, but there's a lot of common themes that humanity has learned over and over again across the millennia. And, you look at the 1960s and some of the things that came out of it, promiscuous culture, free love, a lot of drugs. Like this gets back to the experimentation. Okay, like let's experiment with those things.
Yeah.
Have
Yeah.
those actually had
Interesting.
human flourishing outcomes? I mean,
Yeah.
I would contend those experiments have not paid off. You had massive divorce rates, and now we know that you know children in single parent households don't thrive as well as children in solid two-parent households. Again, not to say you should, there's a lot of reasons that some people might separate from each other, but there are deep impacts from some of those choices people make. And the more I go back and reread Ecclesiastes or the Proverbs or even the Psalms, like there are resonant difficulties that the ancients were facing that echo or directly are relevant to what we have today. And as I get older and older, I realize like, man, they actually were onto something. There's a reason these texts, the survivorship bias that these texts are driving wisdom, even if you're not a religious person. So we should pay attention to them. And there's something really important going on there. But this is to your question about, hey, the 60s, the 90s, and whatever in the Christian church. One of the things that attracted me to the Presbyterian view was just their deep theological rigor. And there are certain things I disagree with, but it's rooted in philosophers of the 8th, ninth, 14th, 15th, 16th
Ooh.
centuries where that they're wrestling with really hard truths. I think one of the challenges the modern evangelical church has, it's only 40 years old. And so they haven't had the centuries and millennia of wrestling with like theological truths in the way that some of these longer term religions have. I'll say one more thing because I know you want to jump in. But what's interesting to me is some of the most intelligent people I know have actually converted to Catholicism
Yeah. Yeah.
because they've been attracted to the deep rigor of that faith. Now, again, I have some theological differences with it, but it's fascinating to me why smart people are in their elder years like saying, you know what, there's something about this culture that's been enduring for millennia.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The thing you meant, I didn't realize that the evangelical church is only 40 years old. So you're saying that the evangelical church did actually arise in the 1960s or well,
I mean,
like
I think there was some precursors to that,
yeah,
probably early 1900s and the revivalist movement, and
yeah,
it's an ebb and flow. It's hard to put that in there,
yeah,
but to me, having grown up in that church and now being in a longer faith tradition, they're still trying to wrestle with, that you have the Joel Osteens and the prosperity gospel. You have
yeah,
that's not technically evangelical, but like that mindset is they're again throwing experiments out there and testing it, and like
yeah, yeah,
you take a step
yeah.
back, like are those things actually driving results in human flourishing, better family life, better educational outcomes? Like, kind of not by their fruits, you shall know them.
Yeah.
Are their
Yeah.
fruits actually tangible?
Yeah, it's so interesting because we can go into the United States and why I think I'm optimistic about the United States as our experiment, as the
Sure.
the founders wanted, because we got the Amendment, which not only protects freedom of speech but also
Yep.
protects freedom of religion.
Yep.
And the most interesting thing I've learned in the last like 10 years, 5 years probably, I think, is that there's a modern understanding that the Constitution says there is a separation between church and state. Turns out that's not actually in the Constitution. If anybody's willing to go listen to this and wants to go find that, please go find it because it doesn't exist inside the Constitution. The
Right.
term separation of church and state actually is in a letter from Thomas Jefferson. One time, one letter. There is like, in France, like that probably during the French Revolution, there was like
Right.
strong separation between church and state. But in the United States experiment, it's freedom from government intervention in religion.
Yep.
So, which is beautiful. It's very subtle. It's very
Yep.
nuanced, but it's so beautiful because it allows what you just said, and which like led to the first great awakening, or no, the second great awakening, led to the Mormons, led to which is an interesting thing based on what you just said. Is like know the fruits. The Mormons are like have a pretty solid lives. Like most of the Mormons that I know, there's definitely some challenging like theological things, but I also have become much less like, so what? Like, what does it matter?
Yeah.
What are the stories that are being told? Like, what really matters? Anything to say on there?
Well, there is some darkness in the Mormon church.
Mm.
And they have remarkable family outcomes. I will acknowledge that. I mean, it was
Yeah,
pretty impressive at business school. The school I went to has this kind of family area where us older students went. It was military and Mormons, and like because we all had kids, right? And their ability to place each other in jobs afterwards was very self-reflective, and they were an organized entity that had a mission and purpose.
Yeah.
And I think we've lost a lot of that in our disaggregation in the online communities. Like,
Yeah.
I'll again say that one of the reasons why I love going to church with my kids is it's a tight community. It's a multi-generational community with lots of vibrant families and old people that my kids will not get exposure to anywhere else in society right now. Now, there's a lot of other reasons why we go there, but that's one of the things I've come to realize is like there is nowhere else where I can go on a Sunday morning, have 2,000 other people between ages of 0 and 80, all focused on one thing together and see the whole gamut of human experience. Like that is just not possible in America right now. So that community
Mhm.
driving nature of religion, regardless of what it is super powerful. I mean, I went to Israel, 9 months ago, and this was 3 months after October 7th. I was just blown away by the level of unity that society has. You can debate, and I've my views on this issue. You can debate like the foreign policy of it, but from a people standpoint, having a singular mission and purpose that gets you through hardship, like community is the thing that drives us through difficulty. And honestly, in difficult moments, saw this in COVID, like at March 2020, a lot of people retreated into their homes, but I also saw our neighborhood come together in a way I had never experienced before because we had to rely upon each other.
What happened to the church in March 2020? Like, or what happened to all the churches? What happened to Christianity in 20? That's not something I've investigated before. Because there are, yeah, yeah.
It's a great question and one that probably warrants a little bit of investigation. A lot of churches have not recovered from that, in the sense that when they dispersed their flocks and they went online, that in-person draw was
It's
actually a
something real.
powerful catalyst.
Yeah.
And churches that maintained, in my understanding, maintained an online presence for longer tended to have a harder time. This is some of the schools tended to have a harder time bringing their flocks back together and are having more challenges now. Like we were in Dallas, our church ended up having in person probably 6 months later in accordance with the Texas state perspective. But like
Yeah,
because we
interesting.
so quickly came back together, there was still an online platform for folks who had a lot of good reasons not to come live, but that live experience just further drove bonds together. But I think in other religious institutions that haven't come back yet, like you need to have that in-person collision of people to drive community.
Yeah, it's super interesting. We're going to do an AI conference at some point down here, and we're going to host it at a church, at an evangelical
Hmm.
church down here. And evangelical inside of Argentina is really interesting because I've spent a lot of time in Brazil. Evangelical, very similar to the United States. A lot of the similar in Brazil. In Argentina, very different. So it's very small here, and a lot of that has to do with masonry, with New Age, because Argentina is more similar to the coastal United States.
Mhm.
And so there was they're Catholic, it's a Catholic country down here, but also kind of going through those secular waves, basically, of a connected culture to the internet.
Yep.
And so there's some really interesting things going on here. And the title of our conference will be AI, is it a god or a demon? Because it goes back
Sounds
to
fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it goes back to San Francisco. Like
Right.
all the people that I was connected to for a long period of time are very religious, but it's not a religious. It's not a explicitly religious. It's actually explicitly atheistic,
Mhm.
but it's something about humanity that we can't not be
Right.
religious. Like it's and
Well,
so
everyone believes in something.
yes,
I
exactly.
mean, and that's why the separation of church and state is always it's a fraught subject because yeah, you have France, which is separated, but that led to the revolution of 1794, which was a brutalistic, atheistic maybe view of the world, but like they believed in that to their heart and soul, which caused really bad outcomes.
Yep.
So like we all, and there's this concept of the blue church here in America, where with the demise of religion, people have looked to politics as their savior, and
Mm.
you look to like, and I'll just use both parties' national conventions. They echoed religious revivals in terms of like the people that were going on stage, the language they were using, the you know there's shibboleths that if you deviate from, you're cast
Yeah.
out. Like to some extent, the lack of religion and the decrease in religion in America is replaced by political parties, and that's I would contend a bad thing. But like it's just people always have to grab a hold of something that they can put their mind to.
Yeah, and the politics is so interesting because it's such a poor representation of like a spiritual. Like it doesn't do the same thing that a belief in the divine nature of existence does. Like the
Hmm.
felt existence of that everything is meaningful and purposeful, and even though you can't prove it, it's just like there's something here and it's important. Like politics doesn't get close to that. Because I mean, well, you talked about the Christian saints from the 8th and 9th century. Like so much of our culture is based in that, like what happened during the Dark Ages, and
Hmm.
then the Enlightenment that came after it. And it's so difficult to lost my point there. But yeah, it's a very interesting time. If there's anything you want to say on that, because I want to go more into technology, and I love frontier technologies, and that's more optimistic. That oh yeah, the political stuff.
Yeah.
It's the fact that the politics is based on the religion, old tradition, mixed with religion. You can't separate them out.
Yeah.
And then, but moving forward into the future, which is going to be very interesting.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, what type of technologies are you most excited about?
I am, I mean, I'm excited about AI, and everybody says that, but I think it really is tied to like what it means for what it means to be human. And so I'll say AI first. We can talk about that if you want. Space, I think that that's about to have a huge unlock, and like we can't even imagine what that will mean for life on Earth. Like there's like a
Mm,
0.1% of society is like focused on what that could be. But in my research, you know, as soon as Starship comes and they're already seeing exponential exp in mass and space, and like what the cascading dominoes that will fall, not just LEO satellites, but like cislunar industries, and then all like this just cascades to something crazy. And then AI ties into this. But then over all of it is energy abundance. Like you don't
yeah,
get AI
yeah,
without energy abundance. You can't get to
yeah,
space without energy abundance.
yeah.
But in space, you actually have access to more energy that we can even imagine. Like energy as the currency of human flourishing is the driver of all these things right now.
Nuclear power in space. I've done a lot of investigation into solar power in space. Is there any sort of interesting conditions? And I've also done interviews with the president of Varda, Delian,
Yeah,
and
yep.
talking about space factories. That's really interesting,
Hmm.
and the
Yep.
space factories are unlocked because of conditions in space. What are the conditions for nuclear power in space? Is that something that's only going to like is what you just said applicable to the future of nuclear power?
I think nuclear will probably unlock terrestrially first. I mean,
Okay.
hopefully you'll
Yeah.
see a lot of the small modular reactors gain foothold. That's going to, again, be driven by market demand. I think you look at the stagnation of energy consumption in the US for the past 10 or 20 years and globally. That's an interesting phenomenon. We've certainly been trying to drive consumption through efficiency, which is interesting, but real unlocks happen when you expand energy. And so data centers and AI is actually the catalyst for all
Yeah.
this right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have on-site energy. So the path there is as soon as you get relatively low cost nuclear or other platforms that drive the cost curve down, now all of a sudden it makes sense to start using those technologies to get to space. And then, when launch costs come down, you can start shipping up all the mass from Earth to build a nascent space economy manufacturing, which then could create the leapfrog catalyst to go to asteroids and others. And actually, Daniel Suarez in his book Delta V has a very near term like this could actually happen using the moon as a catalyst, bringing back the asteroid mining stuff to create fuel on the surface of the moon. Solar in space has so much potential just because it's like 100% always
Yeah.
on absorbing energy. And then you have the laser technologies emerging to actually beam energy either to Earth or elsewhere in concentrated forms that can be transferred. Like it just cascades from, I can't even predict what the future is. There's just so much latent technology willing to be unlocked when commercial viability is unlocked in the first couple stages.
Yeah, this goes back to our earlier conversation about sort of free will and cultural changes and long trends in the 1960s, because it feels like
Mhm.
something happened in the 1960s. And right now, where I'm sitting, it feels like that was well. I go back and forth. But it feels on par negative. Same thing with the 1910s, 1920s.
Mhm.
Feels like that was kind of negative. But then you go back and look at the 1910s, 1920s. What happened there? Electricity, cars, like
Yeah.
really world changing things. So, but going like it's from the perspective of now, it looks very challenging what we're going through. But then in the longer term horizon, it looks very like we have been in the doldrums since nuclear power stopped because energy production stopped. And I agree with you. I'm sure a lot of other people disagree, but human flourishing is directly related to energy production. It's really clear. It's like if
Energy
you
consumption, yeah.
energy consumption. Wait, can you go more into
Well, I
the
mean, energy production is meaningless without consumption.
yeah
Like you can produce all the energy if you're not using it, like energy doesn't matter. It's actually humans consuming energy to do meaningful things. Like
yeah
all these buildings I see outside my window, like it took energy to construct those. It takes energy to heat and cool. Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore said the most powerful catalyst of the Singaporean economy was air conditioning.
yeah
It's allowed people to leave the heat and work for 12 hours a day in buildings to then drive economic output. Like it's the use of energy to then drive productive things for humanity that creates the economic output. You want abundance to allow humans to use energy more, but it's actually the use of energy into productive means that is the currency of
Mm.
flourishing.
And would you say that we've been so the consumption of energy has stalled in the United States? Why did it stall?
I think for two reasons. One is we've had a push for efficiency,
Yeah,
and like I got to get some of this wrong. I'd
sure.
imagine compute has gotten significantly more efficient, and so compute's a big driver of things. Um, that's something I need to go deeper into
Mm.
of why, but it has stalled and it's about to hit an inflection point. Now, energy consumption, the rest of the world has
Yeah,
skyrocketed,
yeah,
especially China and
yeah,
India. As
yeah, yeah.
their societies have gotten out of poverty, their people have demanded more, and that requires more building. It requires more consumption. Requires different type of food. It requires more engagement with the outside world. Like you need that scale of energy consumption to then drive and well, I'll look at the GDP growth in the U.S. is still strong compared to their but it's definitely less than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when energy consumption was going up. And to
Mm.
your point, like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, while there was all this cultural change going on, actually deep technological unlocks were happening in aerospace and energy.
Mm.
And like we were as a society, were able to take all those things for the good and ill to get us to where we're at today. But now there's another, the S curve. We're about to hit another inflection point on that S curve, I believe, on an energy consumption.
Yeah, and how much? So yeah, we talked about it, nuclear power, and then solar power in state space. How much do you find that solar power in space becoming meaningful for energy production in the near term?
I mean, near term, less so, but I
Yeah,
think medium term, it increases.
yeah,
There's a world in which we start to see data centers emerging in space and data center power consumption. You have always on solar energy, like there's a positive feedback loop there. Now you have to reach a certain scale for that to be viable, and you have to have certain costs per mass to get up there for raw materials. But at some point, it also creates resiliency. Like right now in the US, our adversaries or even corporate adversaries know like where all the data centers are. Like that's a huge vulnerability. But if you have them distributed in space, you can pinpoint where they are in space. But like you have this distributed architecture that now is not just land based. You have them on the moon, you have them in orbit, you have them all over the place. Like it actually creates resiliency in the system to prevent outages.
and that's really interesting. I just got an insight into Starlink, like data centers in space for Starlink. Like, is that like is it has Elon Musk talked about that as there's a connection there? Because I've never heard that connection before between like so all of a sudden we're gonna have internet in space. It's always gonna be always on, and our devices will probably connect directly to satellites. And then once you have the satellite up there, and then you have a data center up there, like you said, goes back to that early start of the internet and like why DARPA wanted the internet and the internet because as a distributed mechanism that was always on, like space will just allow that to continue to flourish. Do you agree, disagree? What's your take on that?
I think it's a certainly plausible future, and I don't have any deep insights into what the SpaceX um, uh, future commercial market is. I do think they're in a position that Apple was 12 years ago with the iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
where you have all these flowers blooming in the ecosystem. Apple's able to monitor which ones are working and then when they see something working, they can verticalize. I'll use just very basic, like the flashlight app, right? Like that was somebody who said, "Hey, I'll put a flashlight app on here, 199 a month." All of a sudden, Apple puts it in their OS. Well, as soon as SpaceX sees that, let's just say on orbit data centers are like a big economically viable thing, well, they just use their cost curve to like build their own and verticalize it. But like they're letting the ecosystem flourish and kind of take the winners and then use their scale to exploit it. Like it's actually a brilliant business model. It's just like, what's the sustainability there?
Interesting. And so let's talk about a space economy. This would be really fun to kind of go into what is a space economy? What is the first thing that drops in terms of a space economy? Like what's cool? We already have them, which is there's rockets bringing payload into space uh,
Yeah.
for imagery, for communications networks, but all Earth based. And then, as I mentioned, I interviewed Varda, which is doing the space factories.
Mhm.
There's solar panels beaming energy back to, or trying to beam energy to the Earth. What do you think in going forward is going to be the first ones that are unlocked in this?
I don't have an answer to that, but this gets back to the early conversation about experimentation and letting things win. Something will win in that market, and it's going to have to serve probably a ground-based purpose to drive revenue. But what cost to launch reducing unlocks is people willing to invest and experiment in manufacturing, in energy production, in data centers, in laser production, in asteroid mining.
Mm.
And let's just say only 10% of that wins. The market forces, which I can't
Yep.
prognosticate,
Yeah.
one of those is going to win, and then reinforce that, and then from there something else is going to emerge.
Yeah.
But it's allowing this emergence to happen organically based on where the market's directing, as opposed to, hey, Ben Coleman thinks it's going to be
Yeah.
space manufacturing. That's absolutely was like, I don't know. I just know that creating the opportunity to experiment the emergence will happen naturally.
Yeah. And one thing you said specifically, or that I want to kind of go into, what is the latest on asteroid mining? The last time I checked in with asteroid mining, it's sort of like this far off thing that may happen, may not happen. What's your take on there?
I think there are some promising near-term opportunities.
Yeah.
The medium to long term are more likely where it's going to hit. But like we were talking to a startup, Astroforge, that has a viable mission to go circle an asteroid, like literally in 3 to 6 months. And if they can do that, and then they do the next mission to like actually land on the asteroid, like all of a sudden accelerates. I mean,
Ooh.
wow, that's remarkable. Now, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you need more infrastructure in place, but like it could be closer than we think, or it could be like AI, right? Like when does AGI happen? Well, it
Yeah.
could be 6 months from now. It could be 100 years. But like we need people to push the envelope. And Astroforge's approach is they're taking advantage of a gap in the market right now that they've found with some technology that maybe others have determined they've gotten a first foothold in that could like jumpstart us 10 years. Like I
Yeah.
don't know, but it's an
Yeah.
interesting approach to it.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. There's a question I had about Astroforge, or not specifically Astroforge, but um, very interesting. Um,
But I mean, like I think
yep.
even asteroid mining at the end of the day, like the purpose of that is to get critical materials that Earth needs.
Yep.
It's still fundamentally an Earth or a space to Earth market.
Yep.
Now, the second order of that is okay, you put it on orbit and now you have on orbit manufacturing, then you have a leapfrog approach to do further deep space missions for a variety of things. But at the end of the day, the only reason asteroid mining could ever work is if it solves economic problems on Earth. You can't just have pure exploration and dollars out without some return. It has to solve a problem here.
Yeah. That's an interesting part. And there's the Bezos idea is that it's not going to be moon colonies or Mars colonies that's really going to make space, or really going to be the way of the future. It's going to be space colonies in Earth orbit that are going to be the first unlock, and the way that we make ourselves sort of interplanetary. Do you agree with that? What's your take on that?
I mean, Bezos is a super smart guy. I would never bet against him, just as I'd never bet against Elon. Um, I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, we'll see what the emergence could be. He could be right, and we could find that, building a space colony is just impossible because of all the complex ecosystems we have on Earth and
Yeah,
long-term
interesting.
sustainability. There's actually a great novel called Aurora, which is by Kim Stanley Robinson. He's a very well-known sci-fi author. It's about an interplanetary mission across generations and a ship that leaves Earth to go colonize. What was fascinating about it is that the feedback loops and how this ecosystem starts to break down slowly over time with like one bacteria dying off, and then like what the cascading effects are over generations, and like the shit. I don't want to give it away, but
Yeah.
like it's fascinating to understand, hey, we are in such Earth has evolved or was created or whatever you want to believe
Yeah.
into this really remarkable kind of self-perpetuating cycle. There's a reason why everything on here exists the way it is right now. As soon as you leave that environment, like how do you replicate that after millions or billions of years of natural experimentation? Like there is so much we don't understand that we'd have to replicate in space that yes, maybe we have sustainable moon colonies, but I think there's going to be a lot of things we're discover that we don't understand that we'll have to understand to drive survivability.
That brings the AI to into mind. Right now, I believe that AI is not reasoning. I don't think that there's any consciousness there, unless if like uh, so I don't think like it's conscious. I think it's a simulacra of consciousness, and I doubt that it will ever be conscious because it's not a biological substrate. It's a rock substrate. We made the rocks intelligent, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, that immersion simulacra might actually start to create new novel things that humans can't currently create. And that feels like a very important thing. If that unlocks, then uh, those problems that you mentioned, the really combinatorially explosive problems, might actually be solved by this companion. Um,
Possibly. I mean, one could argue that even OpenAI right now, I would not argue it's conscious, but it is creating something net new. Like even the probabilistic assessment of what words to put where, like that is a net new thing in the human experience. Now, is that creativity? Like, well, it
mm,
depends on what your definition of creativity is. It useful creativity? Like, yes and no. I mean, it gives derivation, but even human artwork is like you can trace back most art to some father and some evolution into
yeah,
something we have right now. Like, what is creativity?
yeah,
I mean, I don't know.
yeah, yeah. I love it. Okay. The Daniel Suarez Delta V. Can you talk more about that book?
Yeah, it's a, looking 20 years in the future, there's an Elon-like character who kind of catalyzes this secret mission to go mine an asteroid, kind of behind the scenes of governments, and all sorts of things happen. And then different governments go to like do this asteroid, and then all of a sudden they start bringing things back to Earth. And there's a follow-on novel. Just a fascinating look at like what technologies would have to exist to get you to that point.
Yeah.
It talks about the regulatory frameworks and like the uncertainty about who owns what in
Mm,
space, and like
mm,
are the
mm.
UN frameworks sufficient to like have property claims
Ooh,
on different celestial bodies, and like what does warfare in space look like at a very nascent level, but like if you have conflicts, who resolves that? It's a fascinating look at like what the near-term future could evolve to be.
let's talk about the regulatory stuff in our current area. Like, do you see? Well, I mean, there's also the fact that China is also doing space stuff. We
Mhm.
could talk about sort of future potential for conflict there. And then there's the UN part, which is that, a lot of sci-fi novels, particularly around the 1960s and 1970s, there's a lot of optimism about the UN. Uh, Given, everything I said in the beginning, like I'm no longer optimistic about the UN. And I don't think that's the right kind of framework. But we're talking about, humans becoming interplanetary. And there's been a lot of talk about global frameworks, which I don't think work because of like it's good to have like a global perspective, but trying to regulate at a global level seems really like getting into deep territory, like what you were mentioning before about like types of things that we can't even think of are going to be coming into our interplanetary future, and the idea that a global regulatory body can even understand those problems is a one that I'm very skeptical of, and it kind of goes back to that experiments, always be experimenting, always be figuring out what is working, what is not working, and that does seem to have a long history within humanity, even life itself. Like that
Yeah,
seems how life is kind of creating. Yeah, what's
right.
your take there?
I mean, if I were to put my prognosticator hat on, I would actually say the closest echo is probably the 1500s to 1600s
Ooh,
colonization of the New World,
yeah.
where you have, probably gonna have moon colonies or space colonies, whatever you want to call them, or Mars colonies. And very quickly, the needs of the home country on Earth are going to diverge from the needs of the frontiersmen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, even if we make the moon a state, which I'm a fan of, but like eventually I think there's a revolution. I think those societies create their own countries. And part of it is just communication delays. I think one of the things that drove the colonists to break away was a 3 month turnaround time to drive petitions. And they were literally speaking they were moving at the speed of newspapers in colonies. Like if you're on Mars, there's a multi-minute delay in a world which instantaneous delivery has to occur, especially where AI might be important. You're going to have localized instantaneous communication, and any delay from Earth is going to cause a fracturing amongst their society. And so you're necessarily going to want to build a solution that's the OODA loop fast within your organization, which means you have to break from the homeworld. And if you thought of fighting a war across the seas in 1700 were hard, just imagine fighting a war for independence across intergalactic, or sorry,
Yeah.
interplanetary things with different Overton and insertion windows and all this stuff. Like, I don't know. I think that the 200-year run rate is we actually have independent countries on the moon and Mars.
Yeah, interesting. Uh, this gets into something for the last few minutes. If you have a hard stop at the hour, let me know. And so the basically we've got uh, what I love talking about is asynchronous work, and we're all going to head for like asynchronous work. Will have like in that future that you just mentioned. Like there's no way we're going to be able to do anything besides asynchronous work if it takes 8 minutes to get a message. I think from the moon. I can't remember whether it's 8 minutes to the moon or the Mars,
Yeah,
but
something like that.
yeah. So it's like so we're going to asynchronous work, and most people don't think about this. The Roman empires were also doing asynchronous work. Like they managed their large empires via letter writing. They had
Mhm.
scribes that they would,
Yeah.
dictate to, and then they would go send off letters. And as you mentioned, the colonists were doing this as well. Um, and so it's really interesting to be in our hyper connected world. And this goes back to the 1960s with the um, whole Earth catalog. Something I've been thinking about a lot recently is the Stewart Brand with his whole Earth catalog, kind of networking all the hippies together, doing their interesting stuff. He put a globe on that magazine, and it was the first time. I don't mean to say that that itself was the first time that we
Yeah.
looked at the globe, but it's like the first time that somebody kind of created this media empire with like everybody was like, okay, this is one globe that we're looking at, and now it feels like it's going to fracture, but that fracturing already seems like it's taking place. Like without CNN, like it doesn't feel like the TV model of broadcasting. Same thing you had with the radio. Radio and TV allowed one person to broadcast their thing with without talking about things like Musk buying Twitter, allowing him to broadcast, Zuckerberg owning Facebook, allowing him to broadcast. Like it seems like our social media landscape is going to fracture as well, pretty substantially. It's already becoming harder and harder to know what's going on in all these little, realms of thought that people have. A lot of them are
Mhm.
becoming more private. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing for the last few minutes. If you have any thoughts on that.
I think that's just a natural evolution to how humanity created societies. I mean, we had this grand experiment in 2010 to 2012 of the global community and commons, but very quickly it sorted into tribalistic groups.
Yeah.
And just as, in the early part of humanity, we tended to cluster in locus to people who had some similar characteristics and then created norms and religions and societies around a certain set of beliefs. Like humans are tribal, and that those tribes fracture along specific lines. Like my most valuable resources now are the signal chats I'm on,
Yeah.
with Twitter being kind of a broader
Yeah.
overlay.
Yeah.
But like those have been self-organized people who found each other, but don't want outsiders to come in because they want that community norms, however those have evolved, and whether it's
Yeah.
memes, whether it's what language you use, who's the in group or out group, like that is just natural to humanity. And this is not surprising to me that social media is fracturing. I mean, what is a little bit surprising, but that it shouldn't be surprising, is it seems to be that social media is fracturing across generational. Like
Mm,
Facebook is now the boomers and
yeah,
maybe the Gen Xers. You have Twitter kind of, and there's exceptions everywhere, but like Twitter's kind of the millennial thing. Instagram is kind of the Gen Z millennial overlap. Gen Alpha, like half of them aren't even on social media anymore. Like these are generational trends, which actually gets back to experimentation and the recycling of creative destruction
yeah,
that defines a society. There is no static nature right now. There's not going to be the New York Times forever in the instantiation it was in 1990. Like that's a good thing. We need that churning of ideas as the generations grow and evolve.
yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. And how can
Yeah,
people
it's
find
great,
out
Stuart.
more about you and more about Qubit Capital?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Ben Kohlmann, BenKohlmann. People can email me, Ben, at Qubit.capital with ideas, companies, thoughts. But yeah, just love to keep the conversation going.
Um,